Everything you know about ancient history is probably wrong. The pyramids weren't built by slaves, Vikings never wore horned helmets, Napoleon wasn't short. These aren't minor errors, they're foundational myths that have shaped how we understand the past. In 2025, new archaeological evidence and historical analysis have demolished some of the most persistent lies we've been taught since childhood. Let's start with the most monumental misconception of all, the Egyptian pyramids. You've seen the movies, thousands of enslaved workers whipped and beaten, hauling massive stone blocks under the scorching sun to build monuments to pharaohs' egos. It's dramatic, it's visceral, it's completely false. Archaeological excavations near the Giza pyramids have uncovered something that rewrites everything. Worker villages, not slave quarters, but actual communities with bakeries, breweries, and surprisingly comfortable housing. These weren't prisoners or captives, they were skilled labourers and farmers working during the off-season when the Nile flooded their fields and farming became impossible. The evidence is overwhelming. Worker tombs have been found right next to the pyramids, something that would never have been permitted for slaves in ancient Egypt. The tombs contain inscriptions honouring these workers, describing them as members of organised crews with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkau. You don't give slaves clever team names. But here's what really destroys the slave narrative. The workers were paid, and paid well. Food was their currency. High-quality meat, bread, and beer consumed in quantities that suggest these people ate better than the average Egyptian. Tax records show they were granted exemptions as compensation for their labour. The pyramid builders were essentially government contractors, not human property. The scale of the operation reveals something even more remarkable. These workers possessed sophisticated engineering knowledge and participated in organised labour management systems that required voluntary cooperation. You can't force innovation. You can't whip someone into solving complex mathematical problems. The precision of pyramid construction demonstrates that these were skilled professionals who understood geometry, astronomy, and structural engineering at levels that impress modern architects. In 2025, Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass announced that advanced scanning technologies have revealed a previously unknown structure inside the Pyramid of Khufu, a 30-metre void with a sealed door deep within the pyramid. This discovery will be fully revealed in 2026, and it's forcing us to reconsider how much we still don't understand about pyramid construction techniques. So where did the slave myth come from? Partly from the Bible's vague references to Hebrew slaves in Egypt, though there's no archaeological evidence linking them to pyramid construction. Partly from Greek historians like Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. Mostly from Hollywood's love of dramatic oppression narratives. The truth is less cinematic, but far more impressive. Free people working together created wonders that still dominate the horizon 45 centuries later. Now let's burn down another myth, literally. Nero fiddling while Rome burned. The image is iconic. The mad emperor dressed in theatrical costume playing music while his capital city turns to ash. Except there's one tiny problem. The fiddle wasn't invented until around the 11th century. If Nero accompanied himself to anything, it would have been a cithara, a type of lyre. But the problems with this story run deeper than instrumental accuracy. 3 ancient sources describe Nero's behaviour during the Great Fire of 64 AD, and they contradict each other wildly. Suetonius, writing about 50 years after the event, claimed Nero ordered the city set ablaze and watched from the Tower of Maecenas while singing about the fall of Troy. Yet Tacitus, considered one of the most reliable Roman historians, tells a different story. He notes that Nero was actually away from Rome when the fire started, staying at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away. When news reached him, Nero rushed back and immediately organised relief efforts. He opened his palace gardens to refugees, arranged emergency housing, and personally supervised firefighting operations. Tacitus even admits that while some suspected Nero of arson, the emperor's response helped many of those affected. The real question isn't whether Nero fiddled, it's why his political enemies worked so hard to make people believe he did. Nero had plenty of those enemies, particularly among the Senate and the early Christian community. After the fire, Nero blamed Christians for the disaster and launched brutal persecutions. Christians, understandably, had every reason to paint Nero as a monster. Here's something else that's pure fiction. Nero throwing Christians to the lions in the Colosseum. Impossible! The Colosseum wasn't built until after Nero's death. He died in 68 AD, and construction of the Colosseum didn't begin until 72 AD under Emperor Vespasian. Whatever Nero did to Christians, and historical records confirm he did persecute them, it didn't happen in the arena we associate with Roman spectacles. The Nero myth reveals something crucial about how historical narratives get distorted. When political propaganda meets dramatic storytelling, truth becomes negotiable. Nero's enemies wanted him remembered as a tyrant. Later Christian writers had theological reasons to emphasize persecution. Hollywood wanted compelling villains. Each generation added another layer to the legend until the real man disappeared beneath centuries of calculated character assassination. But propaganda doesn't just distort the reputations of controversial emperors. Sometimes it completely fabricates physical characteristics of history's most famous military commanders. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man whose name became synonymous with short man syndrome, wasn't short at all. At around 5 feet 6 inches, he was perfectly average for a Frenchman of his time. The confusion came from a measurement mix-up that British propagandists exploited mercilessly. The French used a different measurement system. Their pouce, or inch, was longer than the English inch. When Napoleon's height was recorded as 5 feet 2 inches in French measurements, that translated to approximately 5 feet 7 inches in English. But accurate conversion didn't matter to British cartoonists. James Gillray, the era's most influential political satirist, drew Napoleon as a tiny, rage-filled figure dwarfed by everyone around him. The caricatures were vicious, effective, and completely intentional. Britain needed to diminish their greatest military threat, and if they couldn't beat him on the battlefield quickly enough, they'd shrink him in the public imagination. The propaganda worked so well it gave psychology a term: Napoleon complex. The idea that short men overcompensate with aggression and ambition. Never mind that Napoleon was average height. Never mind that his military genius had nothing to do with supposed physical inadequacy. The lie became so embedded in culture that we still reference it 2 centuries later. What's remarkable is how measurement confusion became weaponized. A simple conversion error, amplified by political cartoons, created a myth that outlived the man by generations. And Napoleon isn't alone in having his physical appearance distorted by historical storytelling. Walk into any museum with classical antiquities. You'll see rows of pure white marble statues, pristine, elegant, timeless. Everything about them screams refined classical taste and restraint. There's just one problem. They're supposed to be screaming in colour. Ancient Greek and Roman statues weren't white. They were painted in colours so vibrant they'd make a carnival look subtle. Reds from cinnabar and iron oxides. Blues from Egyptian frit, a synthetic pigment that required advanced chemical knowledge to produce. Purples from rare organic dyes worth more than gold. The statues we associate with classical purity and white marble sophistication originally looked like they'd been attacked by enthusiastic toddlers with unlimited paint supplies. The pigments deteriorated over centuries. Rain, wind, chemical reactions with the stone itself, all of it stripped away the colours until only bare marble remained. By the time Renaissance artists rediscovered classical sculptures during the 1500s, the paint was long gone. They assumed white marble was the aesthetic goal, so they created their own white marble works, establishing a tradition based entirely on misunderstanding. Neoclassical architects of the 1700s and 1800s doubled down on this mistake. They designed entire buildings celebrating the supposed purity and restraint of classical white marble. Meanwhile, archaeologists were starting to find traces of the original colours using ultraviolet light analysis, revealing patterns invisible to the naked eye. Chemical residues showed where bright pigments once sat. Some sculptures even retained tiny flecks of colour in protected crevices. Recent discoveries in Pompeii have made the case even clearer. Statues buried by volcanic ash in 79 AD preserved their colours far better than anything exposed to weather for 2,000 years. The results are jarring if you've grown up with museum exhibitions. These aren't the restrained monochromatic figures we've been taught to admire. They're bold, garish, almost overwhelming in their visual intensity. The whitewashing of ancient art created cultural ripples we're still experiencing. It associated classical civilization with purity, restraint, and a kind of racial aesthetic that conveniently matched European ideals. That wasn't ancient preference. That was 2,000 years of weathering followed by 500 years of misinterpretation. But sometimes historical myths aren't about what degraded over time. Sometimes they're about what someone deliberately invented to make a story more dramatic. Christopher Columbus didn't prove the Earth was round. Everyone already knew that. Pythagoras figured out Earth's spherical shape around 500 BCE. Eratosthenes calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy around 240 BCE, getting within 15% of the actual measurement using nothing but shadows, geometry, and intellectual curiosity. By Columbus's time in the late 1400s, every educated European knew Earth was spherical. The debate wasn't about shape, it was about size. Columbus thought he could sail west to reach Asia. He was wrong, not because the Earth was flat, but because he grossly miscalculated its circumference. He made two significant errors in his math, leading him to believe the journey would be far shorter than it actually was. The Spanish court's advisors knew his numbers were wrong, and that's why they initially rejected his proposal. They understood the voyage he envisioned would run out of supplies long before reaching Asia. They were right. If the Americas hadn't been sitting exactly where Columbus ran into them, his entire crew would have died of thirst and starvation in the middle of the Pacific. So where did the flat Earth myth come from? Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Columbus. Irving was writing historical fiction, not history. He invented the dramatic scene of Columbus defending his voyage to skeptical scholars who believed in a flat Earth. It never happened. But it made for compelling narrative tension. Brave explorer defying ignorant establishment, man of science versus superstitious tradition. The myth exploded in popularity during the 19th century when writers used it to portray earlier societies as backward and ignorant, conveniently positioning their own era as enlightened and progressive. Medieval Europeans became strawmen, supposedly cowering in fear of sailing off the edge of the world. Completely false, but emotionally satisfying for readers who wanted to believe they lived in history's first truly rational age. The Flat Earth myth reveals something about how we construct historical narratives. We need villains. We need moments of dramatic transformation where enlightenment triumphs over darkness. Sometimes those moments really happened. Often, we invent them because the truth is too complicated, too gradual, or too disappointing to satisfy our narrative expectations. Columbus's actual achievement was significant enough without fabricating an intellectual revolution that never occurred. He stumbled into a continent that Europeans didn't know existed, then spent the rest of his life insisting he'd reached Asia. The man died believing he'd found a new route to the Indies, never accepting that he'd encountered something entirely different. Speaking of people who weren't what popular culture claims, Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't short. The image of the diminutive emperor with an inferiority complex is pure propaganda. He stood around 5'6", completely average for a Frenchman of his era. The confusion started with measurement systems. French inches were longer than English inches. When Napoleon's height was recorded as 5 feet 2 inches in French units, British sources translated it directly without accounting for the difference. In English measurements, that became 5 feet 7 inches. British cartoonists seized the opportunity. James Gilray and others drew Napoleon as a tiny, temperamental figure in their political cartoons. This wasn't accidental misunderstanding. This was weaponized mockery designed to undermine France's emperor. The propaganda worked so effectively that Napoleon complex entered psychology as a term for short men, overcompensating with aggression. The problem? The entire premise was false. Napoleon's military genius had nothing to do with his height because his height was perfectly ordinary. What's remarkable is how British wartime propaganda created a myth so durable it survived 2 centuries of contradictory evidence. Contemporary accounts describe Napoleon as average height. His actual measurements are documented. Yet the image persists because it's emotionally satisfying. We want our historical figures to have defining physical traits that explain their behaviour. A short man conquering Europe makes narrative sense. An average height man doing the same thing is just history. The gladiatorial arena offers another case where Hollywood overwrote reality. Most people imagine gladiators fighting to the death every single time they entered the Colosseum. The thumbs up or thumbs down from the emperor, victor or corpse. No middle ground, except gladiatorial combat rarely ended in death. Training a skilled fighter took years and enormous investment. Gladiators were expensive assets. Their owners wanted them alive for future matches. Most fights ended when one combatant was clearly overpowered or surrendered. Only about 1 in 9 bouts resulted in death. Recent archaeological evidence from 2025 confirmed something Romans wrote about, but we'd never physically verified. Gladiators fought wild animals. A hip bone excavated from a 3rd century gladiator who died in England showed bite marks consistent with large cats. Lions or tigers delivered with enough force to damage bone. The Romans depicted these spectacles in frescoes and mosaics, but until now we lack direct skeletal proof that humans actually faced predators in the arena. Successful gladiators became celebrities. Some accumulated wealth and fame. A few won their freedom and retired. The thumbs gesture we associate with their fate? Probably wrong. Ancient sources describe hand signals but remain unclear about specifics. The definitive thumbs up for life, thumbs down for death comes from 19th century paintings, not Roman records. Then there's the vomitorium myth, which perfectly illustrates how a misunderstood Latin word creates an entirely fictional Roman practice. Vomitorium sounds like exactly what decadent Romans would build. Dedicated rooms where dinner guests could purge their stomachs to make room for more food. Lavish feasts interrupted by tactical vomiting sessions. It fits every stereotype about Roman excess, except vomitoriums were architectural features, not bath chambers. The Latin word means place from which things spew forth. It described the passageways in amphitheatres that allowed massive crowds to exit quickly. When thousands of spectators left the Colosseum simultaneously, they spewed out through the vomitoria. The passages literally vomited people into the streets. Romans absolutely engaged in excessive eating and drinking. Wealthy elites threw elaborate banquets featuring exotic dishes and endless wine. But there's zero archaeological evidence for dedicated purging rooms. The misconception probably arose from combining the suggestive Latin term with existing stereotypes about Roman decadence. We wanted Romans to be that excessive, so we invented architecture to match our assumptions. The truth is more mundane and more tragic. Romans who overindulged chronically developed obesity, gout and other health problems. Many died young from conditions related to their diet. They suffered consequences rather than avoiding them through some imagined strategic purging system. Cleopatra's death presents a different kind of historical uncertainty. The Aspie bite suicide is one of history's most dramatic images. Egypt's last pharaoh choosing death by cobra after Octavian's forces defeated her, the serpent hidden in a basket of figs. The symbolism was perfect. The cobra represented Egyptian royalty, making it an appropriate instrument for a queen's final act. But historians increasingly doubt the snake story. Venomous snakes are unpredictable. A cobra might not bite when needed. The bite might not kill quickly or cleanly. Cleopatra was calculating enough to orchestrate an elaborate double suicide with Mark Antony. Would she really trust her death to an animal's cooperation? Alternative theories suggest poison. A carefully prepared mixture containing hemlock, wolfsbane, or opium would have been far more reliable. Cleopatra had access to the ancient world's most sophisticated poisons. She'd studied pharmacology. A toxicological suicide fits her character better than gambling on a snake's mood. Ancient sources contradict each other. Some mention the ASP, others describe poison. The snake story may have been propagated precisely because it was symbolically appropriate, regardless of accuracy. Sometimes the most repeated version of history is the most dramatic version, not the most likely one. These myths share a common pattern. They reduce complex historical figures and events into simple, emotionally resonant narratives. Napoleon, the short emperor; Romans, the decadent purgers; Cleopatra, the serpent queen. The actual history is messier, more ambiguous, less cinematically perfect. But perfect stories survive better than accurate ones. They're easier to remember, easier to retell, easier to build into cultural mythology. What's striking is how resistant these myths are to correction. You can present evidence that Napoleon was average height, that vomitoriums were hallways, that Cleopatra probably used poison. People nod, acknowledge the facts, then continue referencing the myths anyway because the myths feel true in a way that transcends factual accuracy. Human psychology gravitates toward narratives that confirm what we already believe about how the world works. That psychological mechanism operates beyond individual myths. It shapes how we construct entire historical narratives. Consider the Vikings. Horned helmets define their image in popular culture. Video games, movies, Halloween costumes all feature Norse warriors with elaborate horn-adorned headgear. Archaeological reality. Not a single authentic Viking helmet with horns has ever been discovered. The few well-preserved Viking Age helmets that survived are simple, rounded iron caps. Practical combat gear designed for protection, not intimidation or ceremony. The horned helmet myth originated in the 19th century when costume designer Carl Emil Duepler created elaborate headpieces for Wagner's opera cycle about Teutonic mythology. Those theatrical costumes established a visual language that permanently colonized how we imagine Vikings. Earlier, romantic nationalist artists in Scandinavia had depicted ancient warriors with horned helmets, conflating Viking Age Norsemen with Bronze Age ceremonial objects from over 1,000 years earlier. Bronze Age Scandinavia did produce horned helmets, but those were ritual objects, not battlefield equipment. The chronological confusion persists despite being thoroughly debunked because the horned Viking looks right. It matches our expectations about barbarian warriors from the north. Removing the horns makes Vikings look disappointingly normal, less visually distinct from other medieval soldiers. Entertainment media reinforces the myth because accuracy doesn't sell merchandise as effectively as iconic imagery does. Here's what makes this particularly interesting. The horned helmet isn't just wrong. It's tactically absurd. Horns on a combat helmet provide leverage points for enemies to grab. They add weight without protection. They catch on doorways and tree branches. Any culture that actually used horned battle helmets would have been at a severe disadvantage. Yet we believe Vikings wore them because we need Vikings to look a certain way. Marie Antoinette faces a similar historical assassination, though hers is verbal rather than visual. Let them eat cake has become synonymous with aristocratic indifference to suffering. The phrase supposedly demonstrates how disconnected French royalty was from the starvation of common people. Except Marie Antoinette never said it. The actual French quote references brioche, not cake. More importantly, folklore scholars trace the phrase to sources predating Marie Antoinette's birth. A 16th century German tale features a noblewoman making a similar statement about peasants and Crossem. Jean-Jacques Rousseau mentioned an equivalent phrase in his autobiographical work written around 1765, referring to a great princess, but not identifying her. Marie Antoinette was a child in Austria at the time. The quote was likely anti-monarchist propaganda during the French Revolution, designed to portray the Queen as callous and out of touch. It worked spectacularly. The false attribution contributed to public sentiment that led to her execution. Centuries later, the debunked quote remains her most famous statement, overshadowing anything she actually said or did. False quotations reshape legacy more effectively than actual words because they confirm existing narratives about who historical figures were. Meanwhile, actual archaeological discoveries keep challenging what we thought we knew. In 2025, researchers at Karahantepe in southeastern Turkey uncovered a massive circular structure dating back 11,000 years. Tiered stone seating, carved human and animal figures. It resembles a modern amphitheatre, suggesting monumental communal architecture existed long before agriculture became widespread. This contradicts the long-standing assumption that large permanent structures only emerged after farming societies developed. Also in 2025, archaeologists announced the discovery of the tomb of Thutmose II, the first royal Egyptian tomb found since Tutankhamun's in 1922. On the Greek island of Ithaca, excavations provided concrete evidence of a cult centre dedicated to Odysseus, with a tile fragment bearing a Greek inscription explicitly mentioning the legendary hero's name. These discoveries don't generate the same cultural resonance as debunked myths because they complicate rather than simplify. They require us to revise understanding instead of confirming what we already believe. The human brain resists that cognitive work. We prefer stories that slot neatly into existing frameworks. Napoleon the Short Emperor compensating with aggression. Romans so decadent they needed dedicated purging rooms. Vikings so barbaric they wore impractical horned helmets. These narratives feel true because they're emotionally coherent. They make sense of complex historical figures by reducing them to simple archetypes. The actual history, Napoleon of average height, Roman amphitheatre architecture, Viking practical combat gear, lacks that narrative punch. What's remarkable is how these myths reveal more about us than about history. They expose what we need to believe about the past to make sense of the present. We need Napoleon to be short because we want to believe physical inadequacy drives ambition. We need Romans to be grotesquely excessive because we want to believe our modern restraint represents progress. We need Vikings to look barbaric because we want to believe civilization tamed humanity's violent nature. The myths we tell about history are ultimately myths we tell about ourselves. And when evidence contradicts those myths, we often choose the myth. Not because we're stupid or willfully ignorant, but because narratives that confirm our worldview feel more true than facts that challenge it. That's why these historical lies survive correction. They're too useful to abandon. The pattern becomes clear once you see it. Historical myths survive not despite evidence, but because of emotion. They give us villains to mock, victims to pity, lessons to learn. They transform complicated people into simple stories, and simple stories stick. What makes 2025 different is the archaeological evidence keeps piling up faster than the myths can adapt. Worker villages at Giza, painted pigment traces on marble, Viking helmets without horns. Each discovery chips away at comfortable narratives we've built over centuries. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Knowing these myths are false doesn't make them disappear. You'll still see horned Vikings in the next streaming series. Tour guides will still mention Cleopatra's ASP. Someone at a party will reference Napoleon's height complex. The myths have escaped the bounds of history and become cultural shorthand. They communicate ideas more efficiently than accuracy ever could. This matters beyond trivia. When we accept false narratives about the past, we build false frameworks for understanding the present. If we believe ancient civilizations were primitive, we underestimate human capability. If we believe progress moves in straight lines from ignorance to enlightenment, we ignore how knowledge gets lost and rediscovered. If we believe our ancestors were fundamentally different from us, we miss recognizing the same patterns repeating. The workers who built the pyramids weren't slaves because slavery isn't actually an efficient way to accomplish complex engineering. Romans didn't need vomitoriums because excess has natural limits that bodies enforce. Vikings didn't wear horned helmets because warriors prioritized survival over aesthetics. These aren't just corrections, they're insights into how humans actually behave when you strip away the mythology. Every time archaeology contradicts a cherished myth, we get a choice. Update our understanding or defend the story. Most people choose the story. It's already memorized, already repeated, already embedded in how we explain the world. Changing it requires effort, and the benefit seems abstract. But occasionally, evidence becomes overwhelming enough that myths collapse. The pyramids built by slaves narrative is finally dying in mainstream consciousness because the archaeological case has become impossible to ignore. Maybe in another generation we'll stop putting horns on Viking helmets. Maybe Cleopatra's cobra will fade into footnote status. Progress happens slowly, one corrected textbook at a time. Until then, history remains a battleground between what actually happened and what we need to have happened. The myths are losing, but they're not going quietly.